is Jewish Spotlight, a weekly television program presented by Chabad Lubavitch of Long Island, featuring various aspects of modern Jewish life and Jewish culture. Now, here is your host, Rabbi Tuvia Teldin.
Shalom. Tonight we're going to talk about your soul. Not just your soul in a specific sense, because I don't know your soul, and you don't know my soul. And you know what? I don't even know my soul either. But what we do know is that there is a soul. The question is, how do we know such a thing? How do we know a soul exists? Where does a soul come from? Where does it go? Why is it here? What is it supposed to accomplish? Why does God create a soul in the first place? Those questions are questions I think everybody, once in a while during the course of their life, stops to ask, especially at times when we have some difficulties or some challenges or obstacles in our life. As a result, it's something that's worth spending the next half hour this week and also next week asking about, listening, sitting back and finding out if the Jewish mystics, the Kabbalistic masters, had some answers that can maybe make your life a little bit richer and a little bit more meaningful, and the ability to answer some of the questions about life that maybe you've had for many, many years that perhaps the masters could provide some insight into. In order to do that, we're going to have with us a rabbi here tonight and next week who's done a lot of research into this subject. And we're very happy to have with us Rabbi Dovber Pinson from Brooklyn to join us in order to try to delve into some of these very interesting questions about life. Rabbi Pinson, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming all the way out from Brooklyn.
No problem.
Have you ever been out to this part of the island before?
No, I haven't.
All right.
Yep.
Well, you'll have to come out sometime during the day.
Or when it's not raining.
Okay. So, this is what we're going to talk about. You read a book. This book, very interesting book on reincarnation and Judaism. The book is subtitled The Journey of the Soul. And that's what we want to talk about. This week we're going to talk about the general journey of the soul. Next week we're going to go a little bit more into reincarnation, what it's all about, and what is the Jewish belief in reincarnation. So let's start off by talking in general about the soul. What do the mystics, what does Judaism say about the soul, about where it comes from?
That's a big question.
Well, we only have 28 minutes to answer, and we have a lot of questions, so let's get into it in a very general sense.
What is the soul? You know, there's a story about the first Chabad Rabbi, who was a great Kabbalistic master, Shnei Zalman of Liadi.
Right.
Was once sitting in his study, and he called over his grandson, Menachem Mendel, and said, "Mendel, where is Zaidi?" Zaidi is a Yiddish term for grandfather. He says, "Where am I?" So the child pointed to he was a short child, so he pointed to the grandfather's leg. He says, "That's not the grandfather, that's grandfather's leg." So he pointed to his hands. He says, "That's not grandfather, that's his hand." He pointed to his head. He says, "It's his head, but it's not him." The young child left the room, and a few minutes later, he sneaked into the room, and he called out from the back of the room. He said, "Zaidi!" And his grandfather turned around. He said, "That is where Zaidi is." Mm-hmm. You see, the soul, who are we, and what are we, it's very hard to define who we are. We encompass many things. We have emotions, we have intellect, we have proclivities, we have inclinations, attractions, we have ways we do things, the way we feel about certain things. There's this great human being that's called us that encompasses many different things. The soul, generally, there are two souls to every human being. And these souls are states of consciousness that a person can operate on. There's a selfish soul, which is a soul that usually we operate on, how we do things for our own aggrandizement. We seek our own pleasure, even if it's making money to have a better life, just simply to have a better life. And these are all selfish gains. Maybe even we have children for that reason, we get married for that reason. These are all things that we do for ourselves. And then beyond that, there's a transcendental soul.
Is that by nature bad?
That's not necessarily bad.
It just means that it's self-serving.
It's self-serving. It's a selfish soul. In Kabbalistic terms, it's not called the evil soul. It's called the Nefesh HaBahamis, the animal soul.
Because it just works in a natural way. Whatever comes naturally,
exactly.
It does.
Animals are, unlike humans, don't have the sense of choice, of freedom. They behave the way they are. The way they were created, that's what they are. There's no such thing as an evil animal. If an animal kills, it's not because it's trying to deviate from what it wants to do.
That's the nature that God gave it.
That's the nature God gave it, and it's just doing what it's supposed to be doing.
Right. So when a human being just does things for self-preservation, that's not negative either.
That's not negative. That's selfish. The problem with selfish is that sometimes when a person is selfish, that can bring about being also evil, because where's the limits to your selfishness?
Right. Okay.
So it brings about doing something evil. So it's not necessarily an evil soul, but it's a selfish soul. And beyond that soul, there's also a godly soul, which it says in the Bible that God blew into his nostrils a breath of life when God created Adam, which this breath of life is the soul, is the godly soul, is the transcendent soul, which means that is the soul that gives us a sense of selflessness, where we can operate not on for selfish reasons, but for a selfless reason, and do things not because we feel good and because we're going to gain from it, but because this is the ultimate plan and this is what God wants us to do.
And what is the source for that selfless soul?
That source of the selfless soul is God himself.
So God implants that soul into each human being.
Correct. There's a part of God that's within each one of us, and that is that transcendent part of us. And that gives us the capabilities of transcending the immediate selfish needs and seeing things in a bigger picture. If we want to give charity, and sometimes we feel that it's going to hurt us financially, and so that's a selfish reasoning that's the reason why we don't want to give. But there's sometimes a transcendent self, if we hear there's a deep voice within us, that's a selfless soul that gives us that opportunity and tells us that here you are and you can do something for someone else without feeling your own goodness.
So let's say when a person has that inner voice talking within them,
Yeah.
your feeling is that that's the soul actually speaking to them.
That is a soul speaking to them. It depends
Okay.
with soul. It can be your selfish soul sometimes tells you
Right.
to do things, and
Well,
sometimes
that's
your
the free
selfless
choice,
soul.
to be able to understand what the difference between the two
Correct.
would be.
And to see and to live according to which one that you choose to live according to. Do you
Right.
choose to live a selfless life or a selfless life?
Okay,
And
now
that's-
are all souls alike?
are all souls
Are they
alike?
all the same?
Between me and you, do we have the same soul?
Yeah.
Obviously not. The soul is, besides being a spiritual entity, is actually, according to the mystics, that is the animating force of the body.
Okay.
That means just like every single body, and every single thing for that matter in this world, there are no two things alike, no two snowflakes alike. Nothing is alike in this world. Everything that we see in a physical dimension is a manifestation of a spiritual counterpart. Our physical bodies are shaped and formed in a certain way because there's a spiritual soul that is shaped and formed in a certain way that manifests itself in that
So
body.
that's the meaning of what it says in the Torah, that man is made in the image of God.
That's right.
Literally.
That's right. This image is that soul with its unique dimensions and
Okay, so let's say your soul is different than my soul, right?
Right.
You have a unique soul, I have a unique soul. So your soul has a different purpose then also than my soul would have.
correct.
So God, in other words, puts every single soul specifically into the situation that that soul needs to have in order to fulfill its purpose.
That's a correct assumption.
But wait, I'm making a
A question or a
no,
statement?
no, I'm making a statement, but I think I'm jumping ahead a little bit too much
Uh-huh.
because
Let's
let's
just,
talk about the meaning. What does it mean that a soul has a purpose?
Okay. Every single person that we know, besides, let's take the soul out of the equation.
Okay.
Let's be skeptics for a minute. What is a person, and how do we define a person? So there's basically a famous argument between nature and nurture. That is a person a product of his environment, his culture, his upbringing, his schooling, and his parents' effect? Or is a person really his nature? Whatever a person is, whatever his genetic makeup is, that's who he will be, and there's no choice to it.
Okay.
And that's basically who we are.
And what does Jewish mysticism say about that argument?
Well, let's get to it. So,
Okay.
so basically, we're going to say that, as the empiricalists, many empirical philosophers wrote, that the mind of the human being is really a blank sheet of paper, and experience alone writes on it. That means we're born with a clean slate. If we take the nurture argument and not the genetic makeup argument, and whatever we make of ourselves, that's who we are. In other words, to use another term of philosophy, existence precedes essence. Who we are is only defined by what we experience.
Okay.
And that's really not a Jewish idea, because according to Kabbalah, not only do we have the nature and the nurture, which Kabbalah buys into both of them, And Torah says that they both are real, and in fact that's proven today scientifically that both these things work.
Sure.
But besides that, beyond that, there's a soul that is the third element to this human being. So there is our nature, and there is our nurture, but together with that, there is our soul. That means if a person is born in a certain environment that's conducive to grow a certain type of character, with a genetic makeup for the potential of becoming that type of character, God implants in that person, that particular person, a soul to work in combination with these two elements so they can articulate and become a full human being.
So God, who knows the nature of, let's say, every family, every situation, every sperm and egg that's going to come together to form a human body, knows also what that particular soul needs to accomplish.
Correct.
And puts it specifically into that family at that particular time in history, in that particular
Correct.
culture and society,
Right.
to provide the tools that
So
are
the-
unique to that soul
so
that
the
it
soul-
needs to accomplish its
Correct.
purpose.
So the soul really, the body is the tools of the soul. The body, I'm talking about not only the physical body, I mean, yes, the physical, but I'm talking about even the mind and the genetic makeup and the nurture of the person is the tools for which the soul can express itself.
Fine.
There are some souls that are born to prosperous families, and therefore they may be more conducive to give charity. And God gives a soul that's mission in this world is to bring out this concept of charity within the soul. And He puts that soul into that child that was just conceived. So all these things, all these three things are really working together.
Okay, but when the soul comes down into this world, does the soul have one purpose, or can it have many, many different purposes?
It generally has the purpose of following the Torah, which is a general precept of following all the laws that we're giving over
For
the top.
non-Jew and Jew alike.
Correct. There are different laws that
Right.
Jews and non-Jews have to follow. But beyond that, there is a particular one or two things that every single person comes down for. Besides the general things that a person has to be a good human being by following the Torah, besides that, there's one or two things that are uniquely every single person's. And that is uniquely their task of elevating that particular part.
Why do you say one or two things? Can it be that we have many things that we have to accomplish during the course of our days here?
There are many things, again, that we have to accomplish, but there are only one or two things that we really accomplish well. Some people are multifaceted and they are multidimensional, and they can elevate many parts of life. And they
Right.
can be compassionate and loving, and they can fear God. They can elevate many different aspects of their soul. But generally, a person is very one-dimensional. What we're born with and the certain proclivities that we have towards things, certain attractions we have towards things, always pushes us in a certain way. And it's usually one or two things. It can be three things or four things, but it's usually generally a small makeup of things.
So let's say a person is in a situation where they find that they're constantly tested, or they're constantly faced with certain obstacles in their life. Couldn't that be one of the major purposes, that this soul came into this person, God knowing what they were going to be facing in the future, and that's one of the purposes of the soul, is to face tests and have to overcome those obstacles?
That's correct. That's something that really is going to lead into the next conversation about reincarnation, that there are unique and individual purposes that a soul has to go through and to elevate. And those are unique challenges that a soul has to encounter.
But before we get to reincarnation, just in this life itself.
Sure.
So if a person faces lots of tests, they shouldn't look at it necessarily as a negative. They should say, listen, my soul is here for a purpose. I don't necessarily know what the purpose is. I know in general I have a purpose to observe the Torah and to fulfill God's will in a general sense as a human being in this world, and morally, ethically, in terms of fulfillment of commandments. But specifically, if God presents me with this test, whether it be a physical handicap, a health problem, a financial problem, an enemy who's out to get me, or whatever it might be, that is part of the purpose of my soul being here. And it gives a completely different perspective on the problems that we have in life, because it makes it look very positive instead of negative. It's not a punishment that I'm experiencing. It's an opportunity to fulfill the purpose for why my soul is here in the first place.
That's a correct thing. They say that pain is real and suffering is optional. That if what we experience and we get hurt, maybe even physically, it's a real thing. But how we interpret it, that's up to us, and that depends on our state of consciousness and what we're willing to interpret this reality.
Right.
And the Torah trains the human mind to realize that God created the world. That's how the Torah begins, that God created the heavens and the earth, which is really telling us that there is a plan, there is a great plan out there, And there is a reason for your experiencing this hardship, and this is perhaps one of the reasons why your soul descended into this world, is to encounter this and to see how you come out from this. Do you come out a better human being? Do you come out more whole? Or do you feel all fragmented and you feel less alive because of the experience?
So the free choice that we have in life is really not necessarily the circumstances of the life that we lead, because those circumstances to a great degree can be predetermined, because our soul has to go through certain experiences during the course of the years we have in this world. The free choice would be, do we react to the situation through the selfish soul or through the godly soul?
That's right. The whole concept of free choice is about interpretation. How do we interpret things in life?
What do you mean interpretation?
That means we can
You mean
experience...
attitude.
Yeah, but the interpretation causes the attitude. Do we interpret this as to be something from God? The challenges. We see something that we suffer for a certain reason. And the pain is real. But the question is, do we interpret it as a suffering and it makes us depressed and puts us down? Or do we say, no, this is a reason for something and this God's trying to show me something. Where is this leading me? What's the purpose of this? So when you change your interpretation of what reality is, then you start seeing godliness within this world, as opposed to seeing just a black void. So it's really how we see things.
Okay.
And that's part of the study of the Torah. What it wants to do is it wants to train the human mind to rise to a certain level that they can start observing things and seeing things the way God would see things, and to see things the way it really is, and not only the way our immediate reaction of our selfish soul is and our ego is to see things, to transcend the ego and see things maybe from a different perspective and see things the way they really are in a different reality.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
All right. Now, let's jump a couple of years ahead.
Okay.
Hopefully many, many years ahead,
Okay.
like 120 years till a person is ready to go on to the next world. Now, I've heard people say that Judaism doesn't believe in the afterlife. I've heard statements that to me are shocking as far as people's lack of knowledge of what the Jewish belief is in what happens after death. Can you give our viewers a little bit of a rundown, I guess, on what is the Jewish belief on what happens after death? What happens to the soul?
It's interesting that you
In 5
mentioned-
minutes or less.
I understand that. Basically, Judaism, the reason why people are skeptical, and some people say that Judaism doesn't necessarily believe in an afterlife, is because if you look at the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and you read it through it as a skeptic would read through it, there's really no mention of an afterlife, at least specifically and explicitly a mention for it. And many of the great philosophers, the great religious philosophers, have debated this issue as to why. Why doesn't it mention the afterlife? And many of them give the reason that the Torah is really primarily not interested what happens in the afterlife. Meaning, what God gave us a document to live by is not to tell us, to train us so we can be ready for the afterlife. It's not, the journey of the soul here is not just a bridge to get somewhere else. It's really, the point is really the here and now. God gave us a soul and implanted us in a human body so that it could inhabit the body and transform the body and make it a holy vehicle and a godly manifestation. And then everything in our life, if we do business, if we're married and we're raising children, every mundane action that we do shouldn't just be a simple, ordinary action, but it should become extraordinary.
So what you're saying, though, is that the teachings about the afterlife got pushed to the background to a certain degree because the stress was really on being the best human being you can be right now.
That's
not looking at this world as an entranceway, as a stepping stone to the world to come. Live now for the way God wants you to live.
Exactly.
And what will happen will happen.
Exactly. And not only what will happen, but really what will happen is what's happening now. Everything
that's beautiful.
Everything that we do in this life is really just we're gonna live a perpetuation of what we do now in the afterlife. It's just what happens in death is that the body dies, the human form dies, but the soul, which now, besides being a soul that was part of God that was originally given over to the body, now had 120 years of experiences and of memory and of emotions. All these things now encompass the soul, and they become this whole package. And they go on to the afterlife. So what happens in the afterlife is really dependent on what happens to us now. If we live a spiritual life, unrelated and detached from physical, not necessarily aesthetics, to to discard the physical, but not be over-engrossed and overindulged with our physical lives, then we continue that same life, and the process of death is really just a transformation, and it's an easy experience.
All right. So, well, not an easy experience, but it
At least
depends how you go.
For some people it was. There was some
great
great
mystics and the
great
Kabbalists.
mystics were smiling at the deathbeds because they felt that...
Because they felt the transformation going on, that the soul was liberated from the
Correct.
body. Okay, so let's talk about us.
liberated is a wrong word.
No? Why?
Because that's a Greek idea.
Really?
Yeah, that comes from Plato, from Socrates, that spoke of his body as a prison for a soul.
Right.
Judaism doesn't say the body is a prison for the soul, God forbid. Judaism says that the body is a vehicle for the soul. It's maybe a limited vehicle, but it's not a prison.
It's not a contradiction. In
it's not a contradiction. Judaism works with body and soul united.
Right.
We have to elevate
Definitely.
everything together.
Right.
Judaism is not a religion about spirituality necessarily alone, and about
It's a
sitting in a
combination of
meditation.
physical and spiritual, because
Correct.
God created both of them.
Correct. God is the creator of the physical and the spiritual. God is beyond spirituality as well.
Okay, so I'm sorry for interrupting.
Yes.
I could go in this for a long time,
Okay.
because I'm very interested in that topic, but I
Yes.
want to get back to what happens at the time of death.
Okay.
Okay, the soul, whatever you want to call it, goes out of the body,
Right.
and what happens?
And the soul lives on that same life that it had now in another life. The only thing is then, you see, now that we live in a three-dimensional world, what we see with our physical eyes is real. And then when these eyes, the physical eyes, cease to exist, we're operating with a different set of eyes. And then the soul is seeing things the way the soul wants to see things. So now the soul is seeing what reality really is and what it should have been really doing on this world. And so if the soul lived a good life, a spiritual life, then it looks back in life and says, look, I accomplished what I had to do.
By
and
spiritual, you don't necessarily mean, again, I just want to stress,
spiritual
often,
means-
detached from physicality.
Correct.
It means an ethical,
an
moral...
integrated life,
Right.
integrating God into our
Okay.
daily
Because
life.
sometimes people hear spiritual, they
Correct.
think it's...
Correct.
Okay.
But that means an ethical, integrated life where we have a good balance between our physical necessities and our spiritual welfare. Now, when the soul enters another life form, without the body, it sees things the way it is, the way it truly should be.
Right.
So there, it depends what level the soul operated on when it existed on this world. If it was engrossed with its body and the materialistic part of its body, then it's painful to see that, because now all of a sudden it's awakened to see that it wasted so many years. And
So is that hell?
that is hell. Hell is seeing that you wasted your time.
It's just the seeing itself?
The seeing is the biggest pain for the
It's
soul.
not a transformation that the soul has to go through for all the dirt it might have picked up through the course of its negative activity?
That is the way
The negative energy it has?
That's the way it gets rid of its negative energy, by remembering what it's done. It's like sitting on
Like a catharsis or something?
yeah, no, it's like sitting on a couch on a psychology table by a psychologist or psychoanalysis, and speaking about your youth, all your terrible things that occurred to you, but trying to cleanse yourself of it. And this
Now
is
you have to do it to God.
now you have to do it to yourself also. The soul is now
Right.
the real
So-
judger.
Okay, so Jews believe in hell, and we believe in heaven. Heaven we call Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, which is the place that the soul goes through after it goes through this process of self-purification.
Right.
Now, how long can hell last?
Again, the word hell has a lot of negative connotations.
How long can purgatory last? Or
Even purgatory. These are words that were seeped into Judaism.
how long can the suffering last?
It's not even suffering. It's the cleansing period
Okay,
is maybe
good,
more a correct
good,
term.
good.
According to the Talmud, it can last up to 12 months and not more.
And that's for the worst possible
That's
person.
the worst possible person will only go through a year. That's
Okay.
why we say the Kaddish when someone passes on. We say the Kaddish for that year, hoping that if the soul may have deviated from its purpose and has to go through this cleansing period, maybe the Kaddish will assist the soul
Right.
in elevating to its
But
elevated
interesting
state.
enough, we only say the Kaddish for 11 months.
Because we don't assume that our parents were the most wicked of
Needed
people.
the full year for purification.
Right, no.
Right.
I mean, that would be horrible. But
Okay. All right. So the soul goes through this purification process, returns on after, let's say, the maximum of a year, back to the same place it came from. Where does it go to?
it goes to an even more elevated place, because now it has more experiences.
But
Before,
that's only if it accomplished its purpose. What
It-
if it
oh,
didn't accomplish its purpose?
once it's cleansed, then it's accomplished its purpose.
Uh-huh.
That means every single person, there is one or two aspects of every single person that is pure. It can be even the smallest, minutest detail of a person's life. That purity of the soul is pure, and that will go into paradise after the soul will be purified. And with that comes the whole package deal. The soul becomes all more comprehensive. Before, the soul was very one-dimensional, lived in a world of spirituality and angels and things like that. So it was close to God. Okay, big deal. I mean, there was nothing else for it to do.
Right, big deal.
Right? But now, all of a sudden, the soul comes down to this world, experiences things on the physical level, and elevated it. Now it comes to Gan Eden, to the state of paradise. It's coming with all the physical experiences.
Right.
Now the soul is much more multidimensional, and it's more comprehensive.
Interesting.
And in a sense, it becomes even more infinite, because the soul being, let's say, infinite, before it comes down to the world, is a very defined type of infinite. It's infinite in a way that it is only infinite. Now, because it was just infinite, now it becomes finite and infinite together, because it has finite experiences with it.
In the physical world.
In the physical world, now bringing it back into the infinite level, and the soul is now multidimensional. Not only is it infinite,
so it has a new power to it.
has a new power. It
new
becomes
part of it.
finite and infinite together, so it becomes really infinite.
So it's
The
able to come even closer to God, because
That's
God also created
correct.
the physical. Before,
Correct.
it was not privy to that aspect of God's creation.
Correct.
Now it's privy to that aspect of God's creation. It can even be elevated higher and higher.
Correct. That's the soul's real tikkun, real elevation, is when it becomes really like part of God.
Right.
When it becomes infinite and finite simultaneously, because it comes to the experience of the infinite light in the afterlife with all the finite experiences that it experiences in this world.
All right, Rabbi Pinson, I think we could do this for another 3 hours, but unfortunately we have a limited amount of time. So I want to thank you very much for joining us, and we will, of course, see you again for next week, where we're going to be continuing a discussion of where the soul goes after it gets back to that elevated state. Does it come back into this world? Does it not come back into this world? And some of these issues that Rabbi Pinson brings up, I think are worth just spending a couple minutes after the show thinking about, maybe talking over with your spouse or your friends, because these are issues which really affect all of us. Can you imagine if you had an attitude in life where you felt that you have a soul that comes from God, straight from the essence of God, and a soul that's here for a purpose in your body, not another person's body, and in your family, not another person's family, and in your time and framework and everything else, with your hang-ups and inhibitions and obstacles and talents and great qualities, all for a reason. And if you felt that, and you felt it coming from the inside out, not from the outside in, not because Rabbi Pinson says it or I say it, but because you really think about it and come to peace with who you are and what God made you, and going through the experiences of your life also, feeling that there is much a part of God's plan for you, as is your body and your nose and your ears. Can you imagine how different your attitude in life would be, and how better you'd be able to live life to its fullest, with a sense of inner fulfillment, a sense of purpose and direction, and a sense of peace with everything that happens to you in your life. This is perhaps the greatest gift that Judaism, that Torah can possibly offer you, and it's something I think that's well worth looking into. So put that in your pipe and smoke it for next week. We'll see you next week when we talk about reincarnation. Shalom.
Asagi you, Lord,